Welcome to RHM Grafted In. I'm Pastor Bob Hill, and I'm speaking to you today from my office in Vancouver, USA, in the state of Washington. I would like to teach on the subject of the fall feast of Sukkot, or the time of the Messiah's birth. In this e-journal, I will discuss the biblical facts for the birth date of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. The Bible tells us with accuracy what month and what biblical feast his birth and return will occur on. The biblical narrative conclusively reveals that the birth of the Messiah was not December 25th, nor is it even the month of December. What we learn by understanding what the Bible reveals is that his birth occurs at the fall feast of Sukkot or Tabernacles, which means his conception was near or during Hanukkah. My personal experience. I believed most of my life that December 25th was the birth date of Jesus Christ. I assumed that what we were doing each year in church was biblical and Christian, even though I was distressed about the materialism, Santa Claus, and the scarcity of Jesus during the Black Friday shopping frenzies and the actual holiday celebration itself. I was just following what I had learned from my family, culture, and witnessed in church celebrations. As an Assemblies of God pastor, it had never occurred to me to question where these traditions came from and if they were biblical or not. Scores of times over the years, I was asked to read the narrative that accompanied our church choirs. I did so. I did it joyfully, not realizing I was narrating a fable of men instead of the real facts about the Messiah's birth as recorded in the Bible. It wasn't until late 1997 that I attended a lecture about when was Jesus born. The speaker reviewed the actual biblical narrative of Christ's birth along with the origins and the symbols and traditions used in Xmas celebrations. I was in shock. It was as if he was destroying a sacred cow. From the beginning of the presentation to the very end of the conference, people were stirring with emotions, and both positive and negative. Some heard the truth, and others said during the break and on the ride home things like heretic, legalist, cultist, killjoy, Grinch, and that is law, and we're not under the law. I understand then and now that challenging these traditions is to accept the risk of making you upset, but truth sets you free, and the Bible is the authority that governs the actions of mankind, not our emotional attachments to the traditions of this world. I have learned to embrace this saying: sacred cows make gourmet hamburgers. This may seem like a Christianized soundbite, but I have learned that questioning traditions and asking volcanic questions like when, how, where, and why are these sacred is at best a dicey thing to do in Western Christianity. With that said up front, let's begin, and you decide if it is time to make gourmet hamburgers from sacred cows or let sacred cows remain a protected species. The Western Church, since the 4th century CE, has adopted December 25th as the official day to acknowledge the incarnation of the Messiah. However, most historians admit that this was more in concession to pagan practices than to the Holy Scriptures. The ancient Roman Church Christianized many existing pagan days and festivals and co-opted them into the church in order to accommodate converts who continued mixing their ancient rituals with Christianity. December 25th is a classic case in point. This day happened to be an ancient pagan feast to celebrate the return of the sun after the winter solstice. It had nothing to do with the birth of Jesus, but it was adopted nonetheless by the Church of Rome as the day of the Messiah's birth, and we've been practicing it ever since. Now I'm going to throw up some PowerPoint slides, and we're going to walk through it, and I'll explain the temple service so we know when Zacharias was serving in the temple. We're going to look at many of the facts surrounding the birth of Jesus, and you can draw your own conclusions as to whether you think December 25th is his birth or whether it's a pagan celebration. And you can also draw a conclusion as to when Jesus was really born The fall feast of Sukkot, or Tabernacles, the time of the Messiah's birth. In this presentation, I will discuss the biblical facts for the birth date of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. The Bible tells us with precision what month and what biblical feast his birth and return will occur on. The biblical narrative overwhelmingly reveals that the birth of the Messiah is not December 25th, nor is it even in the month of December. The biblical calculations of the Messiah's birth. Let's take a look at them. Now, we're talking about Tabernacles during the week of Tabernacles. So we're going to get there, but we're going to look at the calculations now. 1. Elizabeth, John's mother, was in her 6th month of pregnancy when Jesus was conceived. Luke 1, verse 24 through 36. We can determine the approximate time of year Jesus was born if we know when John was born, and we can know that. John's father, Zacharias, was a priest serving in the Jerusalem temple during the course of Abijah. Luke 1:5. Historic calculations indicate Zacharias' service corresponds to the 13th through the 19th of June in that year. It was during this time of temple service that Zacharias learned that he and his wife Elizabeth would have a child. Luke 1:8 through 13. After he completed his service and traveled home, Elizabeth conceived, verses 23 through 24. This means Elizabeth's conception of John took place near the end of June. Adding 9 months brings us to the end of March as the most likely time for John's birth. By using simple addition, we can add another 6 months, the difference in ages between John and Jesus. This brings us to the end of September or mid-October as the likely time of Jesus' birth, which is the month of Tishri, or the month that Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, happens. The Companion Bible, 1974 edition, Appendix 179, page 200, absolutely points that out. Now let's take a look at God's instructions concerning temple service. Number 7. John's father, Zacharias, was a priest serving in the Jerusalem temple during the course of Abijah, Luke 1:5. Historic calculations indicate Zacharias' service corresponded to June 13th through the 19th in that year. It was during this time of temple service that Zacharias learned that he and his wife Elizabeth would have a child, Luke 1:8 through 13. The following biblical and historical account identifies when Zacharias' time of temple service occurred. 1 Chronicles 28:11 through 13 explains that the sons of Aaron were divided into 24 groups. 1 Chronicles 24:1 through 4 describes the schedule by which the temple would be staffed in an orderly manner with priests all year round. After the 24 groups of priests were established, lots were drawn to determine the sequence in which each group would serve in the temple. That's outlined in 1 Chronicles 24:7 through 19. Now, here's a graph or a chart of the sequence of temple service for Zacharias as he served. And you'll see that he was from the group of Abijah, and that's number 8, and you find that in 1 Chronicles 24:10. So you can see the scriptures on the left. 1 Chronicles tells you where it's at in chapter 24. Then it gives you the names of all the priest groups that are going to serve. So all of these priests are going to be serving in the temple. There's 24 of them, 24 groups. Now, the sequence of temple service went this way. Each one of the 24 courses of priests would begin and end their service in the temple on the Sabbath. A tour of duty was 1 week. 2 Chronicles 23:8 and 1 Chronicles 9 through 25. On 3 occasions during the course of the year, all the men of Israel were required to travel to Jerusalem for the feasts of the Lord. So on those occasions, all the priests, all 24 of these groups, courses of priests, would be needed in the temple to accommodate the crowds. Those 3 feasts were unleavened bread, Shavuot, Pentecost, and Sukkot, Tabernacles. Deuteronomy 16:16 covers that. So they would all be needed during that period of time. The yearly cycle of service in the temple begins in the spring during the month of Nisan. So the first course of priests would be that of the family of Jehoram, who would serve for 1 week, Sabbath to Sabbath. The second week would then be the responsibility of the family of Jedediah. The third week would be the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? So they all got to be there. All the priests would be present for the service. Then the schedule would resume with the third course of priests, the family of Haram. By this plan, when the 24th course was completed, the general cycle of courses would repeat. So once they went through all 24, it would repeat. This schedule would cover 51 weeks or 357 days, enough for the lunar calendar, about 354 days. So in a period of a year, each group of priests would serve in the temple twice on their scheduled course, in addition to the 3 major feasts for the total of about 5 weeks of duty per group. Luke 1:23, and it came to pass that as soon as the days of the administration were accomplished, he departed. We're talking about Zacharias now, to his own house. Luke 1:24. And after those days his wife Elizabeth conceived, beginning with the first month, Nisan, in the spring, March through April, right in that time frame. The schedule of the priest's courses would result with Zacharias serving during the 10th week of the year. This is because he was a member of the course of Abijah, the 8th course. I've got it highlighted here. And both the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 15th through the 21st of Nisan, and Pentecost, Sivan 6, would have occurred before his scheduled duty. This places Zacharias' administration in the temple as beginning on the 2nd Sabbath of the 3rd month of Sivan. Now, Zacharias' administration in the temple begins on the 2nd Sabbath of the 3rd month of Sivan. And you can see it here. I've outlined it pretty good. First week, second week, third week, fourth week. Now, why am I doing all this? Because it's important to understand the cycle of the temple and when the priests served. Because by knowing this, we can know when Zacharias was on duty and was served and was told that he was going to have a son. And so it's here. It's all here. And it shows us pretty specifically when he was in service and when his term was in the temple. And by that, we can know when Elizabeth became pregnant. After Zacharias completed his service and traveled home, Elizabeth conceived. Luke 1:23 through 24. And when his time of priestly service was finished, he returned to his home. Now after this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and for 5 months she secluded herself completely. The simple truth based upon God's word about when Yeshua, Jesus, was born. After he completed his service and traveled home, Zacharias came home, Elizabeth conceived, verses 23 through 24. Having completed his temple service on the 3rd Sabbath of Sivan, Zacharias returned home and soon conceived his son John. So John the Baptist was probably conceived shortly after the 3rd Sabbath of the month of Sivan, as indicated by the above chart that I just showed you. This means John's conception took place near the end of June. Adding 9 months brings us to the end of March as the most likely time for John's birth. Now, adding another 6 months to that, the difference in ages between John and Jesus, Bible tells us that they were 6 months apart, brings us to the end of September to mid-October as the likely time of Jesus' birth, which is Tisri 15 through 22, which is the Feast of Sukkot or Tabernacles. The companion Bible even says this. Let's look at some additional facts about the Messiah's birth. So we went through, we established when Zacharias was in the temple, so we know when that was. The Bible tells us when it was. It gives us the whole sequence of how the priests would serve, gives the dates. We know when he was serving. We know when he went home. We know the time frame of when that happened. And then we add the 6 months of difference, and we can come up with Tabernacles. So let's look at some more things here. Number 10. Others have pointed out in the inconsistency of why shepherds were watching the flocks in the fields during the dead of winter. The Mishnah, the rabbinic commentary, states that because of winter weather, the flocks around Bethlehem were normally brought into a protective corral called a sheepfold from November through February. Hence, the December date seems unlikely. Adam Clark's commentary. A final clue surrounding the details of the Messiah's birth has to do with the exceptional crowds seeking housing, with the result that there was no room in the inn, Luke 2:7. While it is true that much of this congestion would have been related to the consensus taken by the Romans at that time, there seems to be more to it. Point 12. The Romans were known to take their censuses according to the prevailing customs of the occupied territories. Hence, in the case of Israel, they would opt to have people report to their home provinces at a time that would be convenient for them. There is no apparent logic to calling the census in the middle of winter, December. The more logical time of taxation would be just after the harvest in the fall, when the money's coming in. And they know what people are making, the fall harvest, the last harvest of the year. And this also coincided with what? One of the major biblical feasts known as Sukkot. Because of this, we would expect the entire area of Jerusalem and Bethlehem to be overrun with pilgrims for the Feast of Tabernacles. The Romans always did this with their people. They always held these taxation things and censuses at the time of celebrations where the people were gathered together. They didn't do it at unusual times. Point 13, the nativity accounts in the gospel took place during one of the major biblical holy days and not during December. The only major holy day that takes place in the fall is Rosh Hashanah, Atonement, and Sukkot. It seems that there is indeed a holy feast pointing to the birth of the Messiah. The Messiah came to dwell, to tabernacle in the midst of his people, as perfectly typified in the Feast of Tabernacles. Tabernacles means to dwell, and dwell means to tabernacle. He came to tabernacle with us. He was born on the first day of Tabernacles. So God in the flesh would come to Tabernacles, Sukkot, with mankind on the first day of Tabernacles, which means dwelt. On the 8th day of Tabernacles, so Tabernacles is 7 days, and then there's an 8th day celebration at the very end. On the 8th day of Tabernacles, God commanded that a special day called the 8th day of assembly was to be set apart as a holy assembly. For 7 days you are to bring an offering made by fire to Adonai. On the 8th day you are to have a holy convocation and bring an offering made by fire to Adonai. It is a day of public assembly. Do not do any kind of ordinary work. Why would God command a special memorial on the 8th day of Sukkot? Not only is this the closing day of the Feast of Sukkot, but also this day may contain another connection to the birth of Jesus Christ. Now I say that Jesus Christ was a minister of the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made unto the fathers. This is the Abrahamic covenant. We are grafted in through the seed of Abraham. He came to confirm that. Point 17, Jesus' birth took place on the first day of Sukkot. If this is true, what would take place on the 8th day after a Jewish boy is born? Any good Jewish parent could tell you on the 8th day a Jewish baby boy takes the sign of the Abrahamic covenant through circumcision, Genesis 17. Jesus was presented on the 8th day after his birth, after the incarnation of the Savior. When the time came for their purification according to the Torah, they took him up to Jerusalem to present him to Adonai. Every firstborn male is to be consecrated by Adonai. Luke 2:22 through 23. Point 18. So what is being implied? It is this: Jesus fulfilled every jot and tittle of Passover and Pentecost. By fulfilling both feasts with 100% accuracy, why would the Lord not come and dwell, Sukkot, or tabernacle with his people at the precise time that the fall feasts indicate? The fall feast gives us the Bible's narrative of the Messiah dwelling with mankind at his birth as the King of Kings, and it all happens in the month of Tishri, September, October, not December. Tishri 1 is Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets. The last trump sounds, the dead in Christ rise, and those that are alive are caught up with them. It's the return of the Messiah. Tishri 10 is Yom Kippur, the judgment seat of Christ. Tishri 15 through 22 is Sukkot, the first coming, and then his future coming to eternally dwell with mankind again. He came on the first time on Tishri, the first day of Sukkot, and he was circumcised on the 8th day, and he is going to return again and dwell with us forever, and it will happen again at the time of Tabernacles. Hanukkah is not an alternative to the winter solstice celebration of Christmas. The Feast of Dedication, John 10, which is Hanukkah, is the story of people who said enough, removed man's pagan and religious traditions from the house of God, rededicated it, and then separated themselves from the vain pagan religious practices they represented. His birth scripturally came during the fall feast of Sukkot, Tabernacles, not at the winter solstice celebration of the sun god's son, Tammuz, on December 25th. This is where December 25th all started. Nimrod married his own mother, whose name was Semiramis. When Nimrod, the founder of Babylon, died, Semiramis told the people that her husband's spirit had taken possession of the sun. She encouraged the people to pay homage to her husband by worshiping the sun. After Nimrod's death, his wife, Semiramis, propagated the evil doctrine of the survival of Nimrod as a spirit being. She claimed a full-grown evergreen tree sprang overnight from a dead tree stump, which symbolized the springing forth unto new life of the dead Nimrod. On each anniversary of his birth, she claimed Nimrod would visit the evergreen tree and leave gifts upon it. December 25th is the day. This is the real origin of the Christmas tree and the celebration of Christmas. This is where it all started. This is the root of all of it. It started here, and it has evolved into different practices. Thus began the evil practice of sun worship. Later on, when Semiramis gave birth to a son by the name of Tammuz, she hid her wife, immoral form of living by lying to the people. She told them that the spirit of her dead husband, Nimrod, miraculously overshadowed and impregnated her. This is how she was able to bring forth this so-called Son of God named Tammuz. Semiramis also declared that her son, Tammuz, was in actuality the return or rebirth of her husband, Nimrod. Hence, through this teaching, the doctrine of reincarnation was born. And since Tammuz was born on December 25th also, this day was highly honored and recognized. Therefore, the date, December 25, was observed in honor of the birth of Tammuz, the son of the sun god Nimrod, long before Christianity existed. And it was many centuries later that this pagan custom was co-opted together and Christianized by the ancient Roman Church as being the birth date of Jesus Christ, Christmas Day. Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz are the root system of the great organized worldly apostasy of the elaborate Xmas celebrations of modern societies that dominate our present world. Because worshiping the Father in spirit and truth are foundational to the Christian way of life, I want to encourage you to research and find out for yourself where the Yuletide, winter solstice, and Xmas traditions originated. Gideon had to make a choice to pull down or leave up the sacred pillars. What will you do? Moses had to destroy the sacred cows. It is my prayer that we all learn to make sacred cows into gourmet hamburgers. In 2 Timothy 2:15 it says, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." Let's find out. I just want to encourage you to find out for yourself. So let's take a look at a few things here, and I'll buzz through them quickly. Ask yourself these questions, or just do the research. You can take these questions and Google them, and you'll find out a lot of information about this. So Jesus was born at the Feast of Tabernacles. On the first day of Tabernacles, he came to dwell with mankind. And on the 8th day celebration, he took the Abrahamic covenant, fulfilling that so that you and I can be grafted in through the seed of Abraham. Now, let's take a look. How did all this stuff get started? Now, I'm just going to throw out some questions, and you can use them. You can research them. You can find all this for yourself. Since the Bible reveals that the Messiah was born in the fall, how did a December celebration get started? Why are Xmas traditions not in the Bible or found in ancient or current Hebrew history? Why do we decorate a tree during Xmas, and where did it originate? What does Jeremiah 10, 1 through 4 say about these ancient and modern practices? Why is mistletoe hung in doorways or a circle evergreen wreath on a door? What is Yule? Why is a Yule log burned during the winter solstice? Where did the 12 days of Christmas originate? Was the winter solstice celebrations ever outlawed in England? Did the Puritans outlaw the winter solstice celebrations of Christmas in the New World and fine people 5 shillings for celebrating Xmas? Protestant churches in the New World did not celebrate Xmas for over 200 years. Is this true? For 200 years in America, they never celebrated any of these things? And were they outlawed? You might look it up. Is it true that the U.S. Congress starting from December 25th, 1789, and for 76 years thereafter did not break for or recognize the Xmas celebration? When did the wise men arrive to give Jesus their gifts? Does the Bible say there were 3 wise men at the manger? Was Jesus a newborn or a 1 to 2 year old toddler when the wise men arrived with their gifts? Why did Herod kill all the children 2 years and under? If they only gave gifts to Jesus, why do we give gifts to ourselves? Where did personal gift giving during the winter solstice of Xmas come from? Where did Santa, elves, and reindeer come from? The fall biblical feasts of the Lord and other Hebrew celebrations mentioned in the Bible have nothing in common with the Xmas winter solstice celebration. The biblical celebrations are recorded in Leviticus 23 and are also validated by Jesus present at them and by what he taught during them. God told Moses, "They are a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you." Exodus 31, 12 through 13. Zachariah tells us they will be celebrated during the 1,000-year millennial reign of Jesus Christ. Zechariah 14, 15 through 16. Isaiah tells us that they continue on in eternity after the new heaven and new earth is completed. Isaiah 66, 22 through 23. If Jesus and the disciples celebrated them and they continue during the millennial reign and in eternity, wouldn't our faith be better served by understanding and practicing them on earth as it is in heaven? Colossians 2:8. See to it that nobody enslaves you with philosophy and foolish deception which conform to human traditions and the way the world thinks and acts rather than Christ. Father, I just present this to those that are listening. I ask, Lord, that you will let truth prevail and that those that have never heard when Jesus was truly born understand and know when he was born now, and put away these pagan hallmark holidays that are full of rudiment traditions of men and vain philosophies that entangle us. And may we be set free by the word of your truth. And Lord, may we serve you with whole hearts, and may we not mix the cup of devils and the cup of the Lord together any longer. And we thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen. Friends, this is Pastor Bob Hill. Thanks for tuning in on RHM Grafted In. I hope you enjoyed this presentation on when was Jesus born.